day, one and all. Welcome to TELSIC. This is Phil Martin from the University of York, and today I'm talking with Mike Perkins about his new article, Reimagining the Artificial Intelligence Assessment Scale, or AIAS, a refined framework for educational assessment. And this came out in the Journal of University Teaching and Learning Practice back in September. Mike is head of the Centre for Research and Innovation at British University Vietnam in Hanoi, and he's certainly been one of the guiding lights on how we can adapt to the current education climate. The AI assessment scales have influenced policy of over 350 institutions around the world at the last count and have been translated into 30 languages. For listeners not familiar with the AI assessment scales, this is a framework developed by Mike and his co-authors Jasper Roe, Furze and Jason MacVaugh. And this was designed to give educators and students some guidance on how GenAI could be integrated into teaching and assessment. It's evolved a fair bit over the last couple of years, and in the latest paper we're talking about today, Mike, Jasper and Leon respond to some of the critiques of the scales. They talk a fair amount about assessment validity and some of the ways in which the scales have been misinterpreted and misapplied. They also give some concrete examples of how they see generative AI being integrated into assessed tasks. Links to the papers are in the show notes, as well as some of the other studies that Mike and I touch on during the conversation. None of these are required reading before you listen to this, but if you're interested in following up on anything, then these will give you a good starting point. Mike and I talk about how he came to be involved with AI and assessment, the differences in responses from various parts of the world. We discuss the role of AI in learning, discursive versus structural changes to assessments, comparisons with Sydney's two-lane approach, and Mike also gives some advice for those looking to form a productive writing team, and many other topics. So without further delay, I bring you Mike Perkins. Morning, everyone. I'm here with Mike Perkins. Mike, thanks for being here.
Hi, Phil. Thanks. Great to be here.
We're going to talk today about the newer iteration of the AI assessment scales. We've got a couple of articles out, and we've also got the how not to use the AI assessment scales, and we've got the new one, which is in the Journal of University Teaching and Learning Practice.
That's right.
Was there a sequence in which these were supposed to be read, or because they both came out at roughly the same time? Is that right?
Yeah, and that's just how academic publishing works. Nothing happens and then they all come along at once. I guess in terms of the sequencing, probably the revised AI assessment scale in the Journal of University Teaching and Learning Practice. That's sort of the core elements, and then the editorial and the commentary in the JALT publication. That's more of an understanding how to actually apply these in practice. But in reality, you can read them in any order you want, because in the commentary we do talk about a wide range of how people have applied the scales, plural, and all variations on the scale from the very first version we created up until the new version. But also, people have taken the scale and run with it themselves.
I mean, you're widely published already, and I will have given you a full intro at the start of this podcast. But can you just give us your potted bio as well? What do you focus on a day-to-day basis? What's your current role, and how did you get into AI and assessment?
Okay, cool. So I am based at the British University of Vietnam out in Hanoi, Vietnam, and I came out here for 1 year, 12 years ago. And so those original plans of as my supervisor in the York Management School, he said, "Okay, Mike, go out to Vietnam, enjoy yourself, and then come back and then start your academic career properly." And I said, "Sure, Kieran, no problem. We'll go and do that." And then things just sort of evolved from there. So my background, I was doing my PhD at the University of York in the York Management School, the School of Business and Society. And I was exploring public perceptions of the police and public sector bodies. And so my research was very much a performance management area. And then when I came to Vietnam, my role was one looking at quality and assessment. And I was responsible for revising our university's policies around assessment. And this led into exploring academic integrity and understanding how we can help support students in academic integrity. And from then on, my research sort of evolved into thinking about what are some of the newer technological threats actually emerging, and how can we actually deal with those, and what impact might this have on academic integrity? So myself and my colleague Jasper Roe, we were looking at article paraphrasing tools, so tools that students were using to try and evade similarity detection metrics from Turnitin and other such software. And then I was looking at some other areas around this, and I saw there was a bit of chatter online about large language models being used by students, by tech-savvy students, and evidence that these were sort of starting to creep into some practices from students. And so I wrote a review exploring the potential implications of this from an academic integrity perspective, submitted this to a journal, and then literally the day after I submitted this piece, ChatGPT came out. So This is really where the move into AI came out, because of course from that piece there was a lot of interest in terms of, okay, so how is this going to affect how students work, how teachers respond to what students are doing, and the research sort of kind of evolved from there. And this led on to the work around specific focus on assessment in generative AI, which is where we are now.
Yeah, so I noticed, when reading through some of your previous articles, you got a focus. You've written about EAP, I think, and you reference English for academic purposes in the articles. I was going to ask because I didn't see in English for academic purposes like a direct link in your bio. Do you have an interest in this, or how did that link come about?
Very much have an interest in this because my university, the majority of our students are Vietnamese and therefore second language learners. They're doing English as a foreign language. And so I've been very much aware of the specific challenges that EFL students face when they're in a university setting, and a lot of the research around academic integrity does sort of consider this. And there's a bit of an unfair blame placed at the foot of students who are studying a second language, saying they're more prone to plagiarizing, they're more prone to these academic integrity violations. But often this comes down to a misunderstanding of EAP and what does it really mean to actually study in English, and what are the typical academic conventions. So I do have an interest in this. I haven't taught this in a way, but a lot of the work that I've done around EAP and EFL, this comes through Jasper. So Jasper was an English language teacher, head of English at James Cook University, Singapore, before taking on his role at Durham University now. And so a lot of the work around EFL, EAP came about through working with Jasper.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I was going to ask you, because you've got quite an international writing team there who've been involved in the development of the scales.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you'd noticed the differences in the responses between the UK and Australia. And when we came off the back of COVID, the UK certainly became a lot more open to putting the responsibility on students. So we had a lot more kind of unsupervised essays, and I think there was a recent paper about this. I'm not sure if you came across it. It was about the number of so-called summative online
unsupervised things. Yeah, I read
remote.
The paper. Yeah.
So it was a bit of a critique there of the way the UK is approached, or it still is, towards academic integrity. But Australia, I think you mentioned at several places in the article, there's been a return since COVID to kind of pen and paper exams, and something which you sounded a little bit apprehensive about in the paper itself. So the two seem to have diverged in their approaches, and this might affect how they would treat the presence of GenAI. Is this something that you compared notes on in your team when you were working on this, and do you sort of see any difference in the approaches between the two?
Yeah, I think we definitely saw differences in approaches on a global basis. I'd say that Australia as a whole, and Australian universities, and specifically Group of 8 universities, they were some of the first to really take a major clear response following the emergence of GenAI tools. And this was really positive to see. And in terms of regulators as well, TEQSA have had a very, very forward-thinking approach in terms of saying to universities, look, there's this new technology, we know about it, you know about it, what are you doing, what are your plans for dealing with this? So I think there's been very much a proactive, maybe a little bit more of a joined up approach from the Australian sector. I would say that the approach from UK universities hasn't necessarily been so joined up. Russell Group put out statements in terms of their policies and their views towards generative AI tools fairly quickly. From a multi-university perspective, having something was pretty solid. Didn't necessarily agree with all of the recommendations that they made, but it was good to be able to say, look, this is our general view. But this does differ then on an institutional basis. So it's hard to make broad sweeping statements about this, but Australian universities were very quick to move back to pen and paper exams once ChatGPT initially came out, because they said, look, we've got this unknown threat. We don't know what to do about it yet, so we're going to play it safe. Whereas UK universities didn't really make so much of a quick change in most cases. Things just went along as usual, and people saying, oh no, what's happening? But not necessarily a joined up response in many cases. And even now we're talking, so we're late 2025, ChatGPT was released 3 years ago now, almost to the day. So
feels like longer.
Yeah, it does, but still we're talking about universities who don't have clear policies on generative AI. Like, why? Why is that the case? Shouldn't take that long to come up with these approaches. So I think Australia has done a really strong job as a sector in terms of making progress in those areas.
Yeah, I mean, definitely there's all of the leading voices seem to be coming out of Australia, and there's a lot of people there who are definitely worth following and seeing what they're doing. One of the things that I noticed about the new paper that you published, as I said, I think as I touched on when we were chatting offline, I noticed that there's quite a change in tone. So you've revamped the scales. We've got new 5 steps. They're similar, but you've added, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But I also noticed that the text, the way that you're writing about academic integrity and discourse and transparency has shifted a little bit. And I can get into why, but I just wondered, is there anything that you and the team kind of changed your minds on over the last couple of years? Have you sort of thought, actually we had that wrong? And that wouldn't be a criticism. I think it's absolutely really refreshing to see these kind of changes and updates in thinking. So how have you all progressed on this, and have you all pulled in the same direction as a writing team?
Yeah, there's definitely been changes in our views, and a lot of this was driven by the technology and what technology was promised at the time. So when we started developing the scale, we were working at a time when there was an assumption that it was kind of possible to stop students from using AI tools or to direct their usage in a specific way. And the first version of the scale was maybe a little bit more explicit towards a student focus, saying that this is how you should be using AI tools. Whereas we came to sort of change our views on this and really recognize that these technologies are here to stay. Technological approaches to detecting AI use aren't feasible anymore. So although we've always maintained that the AI assessment scale is not something, it's not an assessment security tool, we did sort of change the language around there to make it more clear that this was focused around design choices that educators are taking. So I think taking some of that responsibility and that blame in a way away from students using tools to how we are adapting to new technology was probably a big shift in thinking. In academic integrity literature, and when you hear a lot of educators talk about academic integrity, it's often a bit of a focus on what the students are doing and how the students are doing things wrong. But I think it's really important to focus on what we're doing, and trying to say the students must comply with our rules without changing our own practices isn't something that's really tenable anymore. So that was probably the biggest evolution of there, as well as some sort of minor shifts in terms of recognizing the potential for AI tools to actually be used to draft text in an ethical manner. This was sort of one of the hard lines and sort of a very clear point in our older version of the scale. And we did adjust this now because we recognize, look, you can't actually tell whether or not a student has used AI to edit their text or actually to draft text themselves. And it's probably a big change in that point.
So when we talk about with the original thinking behind the scales, and you're bringing it in to address the fact that this technology is here, it's not going anywhere, and we are in a position of responsibility to kind of make the best of it with the students. Was there a thinking that AI, because you talk certainly in the earlier paper about the potential benefits of AI and kind of the need to skill students up in this direction, was the thinking that by incorporating AI into the teaching and the assessment process, we're actually enabling further movement towards the learning outcomes? Or was it more that these are new skill sets that we're going to pick up along the way?
Yeah, I think the thing that we want to be really clear on is that universities are there to teach students their subjects that they've signed up to teach. They shouldn't be there to turn every session into an AI session because it's the hot new technology. So this is why when we've created the sort of various tools to allow people to adjust their assessments, we start from the learning outcomes and we say, look, what is the learning outcomes of your module? And then the question is, how much might AI help support or detract from the achievement of those learning outcomes? If AI can be introduced in a way that doesn't detract from those learning outcomes, great, use it. If it would prevent students from reaching those goals, then that's when we look at assessment methodologies that don't involve AI. There may well be cases where AI does become integrated as part of the learning outcomes for modules. And this is often the case when we think about the broader graduate attributes that universities are trying to instill in their graduates. But this is generally at the higher levels of the scale. We don't want every assessment to just turn into, and do something using AI just because you can. Ethically integrating generative AI doesn't mean just giving students carte blanche to use AI for everything. It means being smart about how this is used. And that's a design choice from the educators themselves.
Yeah. I mean, you give some really great examples on the one thing I really like about the new article is that it's kind of a dialogue on this with the community, and you've responded to some of the critiques of the earlier models, and I'll get into those in a sec. But the really interesting part was also where you talk through some of the examples where AI could be used constructively in teaching. So I think you go through each of the levels on the revised scale. And you give a little example. I think one of them was lining up a shot sequence on a media course, for example. And so I'm just thinking in that, as I was reading those, I was kind of on this point of what AI is bringing to the table here. Do you have any examples of how? Let's stick with the shot sequence example. So we've got some media students who are shooting a film. At what point would the presence of GenAI here really enable students to better understand how to construct a shot sequence themselves? And bearing in mind, we're kind of squeamish about moving to no AI. We don't really want to ban anything. But if we're focusing on the process rather than the product, is there a way in which you can see GenAI being used to develop a shot sequence from a set of prompts that would really furnish students with an understanding of how this content works better than had they done it themselves from scratch?
So I'll preface this by saying that I'm not in that particular area in terms of media studies. We were giving some various examples, but this could be a case where you're giving students more options. So by allowing students to sort of experiment on a virtual basis with the GenAI tool to say, well, look, this is what I'm trying to do. Give me some ways in which I might sequence this shot. The decision as to how that shot is actually done rests on the students, and the students will go and do this. But it could potentially reduce the time needed for the trial and error that the students might go through with an AI tool suggesting some various more standardized ways to do this given their particular circumstances. So whereas students, sure, they might have the resources available to them talking about how to sequence a shot in general, but by being able to integrate their context into the specifics, this just might help speed up their achievement of the learning outcomes in a bit more detail. Again, that's like the planning process. It's not something that the students still have to create those shot sequences themselves and still have to do the work, but just speeding up that process in terms of getting to something that might work, could be a use where we don't see the learning outcomes not being achieved.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's a few other, just scanning through the other examples here, which they're really good. I mean, you talk about coding and how the advanced AI tools might help students move towards a better understanding of how to code in a particular language. But really, I was wondering if the rationale behind this question was because when I've been reading through the literature on this, it seems like a chasm has opened up in the road between assessment for learning and of learning, and we used to have this albeit flawed method of take-home essays, reports, projects, digital tasks and things that students could do unsupervised, which were just fantastic tasks and great, really good learning opportunities. And they were the product would also be evidence of the process. And we could say with a certain degree of confidence that, okay, I can see evidence of learning here. The student has, clearly got a grasp of some of the things that the course was intended to teach. There were sort of potholes in that road because we've always had essay mills and we've always had various ways of skirting around what was intended. But it does seem that the presence of GenAI has turned these potholes into a sinkhole, and it's now very hard to do any of this stuff. And I keep wondering if we've lost something really valuable as a tool because we can. I'm going to jump into the sort of comparisons with Sydney's Lane 1 and Lane 2 in a minute. But is there a way, do you think, of retrieving any of this, either with the assessment scales or with restructuring of assessments themselves, where we can actually use these projects that it would be crippling if we lost these, I think, from higher education as means of assessment. But is there any way you can see that we can bring them back into the fold, use them, make them summative in the sense that students really have a motivation to do them and to do them properly with GenAI being in the mix?
Yeah, I think that first of all, we've got to recognize where we have some foundational elements in a unit, a module, a program, where we've got to say we need to know as an institution that students can do these certain things, these sort of fundamental aspects. And in those cases, then I don't think there's the space necessarily for the unsupervised assessments. This is where we say that the level 1 no AI assessments are really valuable here, but it's making sure that there's actually some sort of security there, with the understanding that we can't have an unlimited amount of security, and just because something is in an in-person exam doesn't necessarily mean it's secure. But you're right in that in things like projects, things like reports, they do have value in terms of teaching students how to construct their thinking, construct a long-term outcome, and also create a product, because this is also what we're training students to do, to be able to create something, to be able to create an output, not necessarily just demonstrate their learning. We think, why are we teaching students to do something? Why are we asking students to do this task? For us, it's for them to demonstrate that they know how to do something, but we want that practical element in there as well. This is but that gap between assessment for learning, assessment of learning is something that has troubled us. So one way that we have been sort of expanding our thinking around this is a concept which we call assessment twins. We got a recent paper under review at the moment. It's out as a preprint, looking at this idea that whenever we do an unsupervised assessment, because they are valuable in exactly the ways that you've described, what we might also consider doing is an additional, more secure assessment to match up with the learning outcomes. So rather than splitting a module learning outcomes into, we've got 4 learning outcomes, and typically what we might say is assessment 1 covers learning outcome 1 and 2, assessment 2 covers outcomes 3 and 4. If we have assessments where multiple assessments are actually covering the same learning outcomes, we get a little bit of security and a little bit of backup in recognizing whether or not students have actually learned the content, they actually know what they're talking about. So this might mean that when we ask students to use those types of unsupervised assessments, reports, etc., we match it up with just a very small additional piece of work. So this could be, traditional case would be something like a Viva, just to check that the student does actually understand what they're talking about. It might be a quiz on the content. It might be a debate. It might be some sort of a presentation. But either way, we're twinning a supervised form of assessment with an unsupervised form of assessment to give a little bit more security and not necessarily a guarantee, but just a little bit more certainty that the students actually learned what they're supposed to learn. And then we can use data which we get from that either on an individual basis, whether we say, maybe the student receives a mark of 80 on a take-home report, but can't explain anything in a Viva, and we might look at capping the marks, or on a larger cohort, where that's not possible, maybe we look at this from a broader cohort perspective, where we say, I don't think this assessment format is really suitable in this current way, because we can see the gaps between the supervised and the unsupervised assessments being quite large. Therefore, that gives us some information that means we need to do something a little bit differently. So we're able to continuously revise and adapt our assessment practices.
Yeah, so maybe this is a good time to talk about Sydney's 2-lane approach, as it sounds like there's some parallels here between what you're describing in this idea of so-called lane 1 assessments that are secure and an open lane that are for lower stakes assessments. And this is what Danny Liu and Adam Bridgman have put forward, and they've also been, I know this model has also been quite influential. And there's a section in the paper where you talk about how the assessment scales and the 2-lane approach kind of relate to each other. Are you pretty much aligned with Danny and Adam's thinking on this? I'm not sure if you talked much with them or there's been dialogue between you guys. But it sounds like you are fairly aligned on this. Are there any points on what they've done in which you'd sort of depart?
Yeah, I certainly think it's fair to say we've got differences of opinion in how these areas work. The AIAS and the 2-lane approach are not sort of choose one or the other. And as we talk about in our paper, they are different ways to achieve what is essentially the same challenge. How do you balance out assessment security with assessment validity, with authentic learning, with integrating new technologies? And just different ways of doing that. The 2-lane approach is great because you've got the idea that you can say, well, we've got the secured assessments, but the secured assessments in the 2-lane approach might also include some use of AI. So there was this kind of view that the lane 1 was no AI, but it's not always the case. Whereas for us, we say lane 1 is about no AI because it's fundamental skills. And then I guess where we differ in opinion is that we believe there are broader ways of developing assessments and designing assessments that go beyond just saying do whatever you want. We think there's a lot of room for educators to design assessments in a certain way. So we've got the lane 2, 3, 4, and 5, and all of these are there to achieve different things rather than just saying go and do whatever you want. The 2-lane approach, sort of that's a nice way of doing it, but I think it doesn't quite capture the nuance, because we also recognize that away from a supervised assessment, you can't stop students from using AI. And that was probably the biggest criticism that has been leveled against the AIAS, that you can't stop students from doing this, which is why we changed the way we talk about this to emphasize that it's a design approach. Yeah. So I think that's probably the big differences there. But we think there's just this a little bit more nuance in how assessments are designed compared to just saying to students, you can use AI however you like.
Yeah, so there's a part of in the paper where you respond to the critiques around discursive versus structural changes, and I think one of the more widely circulated critiques was the paper by Thomas Colbin, Phil Dawson, and Danny Liu, and they raised this issue of discursive versus structural. And you talk a lot more in the new paper about structural changes and the need for these to take place. So one of the questions I was going to ask, and I put this to Danny as well, he was on the podcast a few episodes back, with structural changes, I'm not sure if you'd agree, with what they're proposing into how profound the structural changes need to be. But it did occur to me that this is just the sheer scale of this kind of operation. So how are you approaching this in a certain way at British University Vietnam, and with your, the dialogue that you've had with other institutions around the world, how are institutions who've decided to go ahead with structural changes, and I agree that that's an extremely wise thing to do, but it's just the amount of barriers that you'd run across in terms of resources, getting buy-in from established lecturers, module lead with entrenched ways of working, trying to talk to them about why these changes were necessary before you get into the administrative side of pushing all these changes through. When I put this to Danny, he was kind of confident. He said it hadn't been easy, but there'd been broad acceptance on an institutional level. How have you found this, and what's the sort of responses been from people you've spoken to? Have they found structural changes? How are these going, do you think?
Yeah, okay. So quite big question. So a few parts of that. So first of all, structural versus discursive. I think both are important. And one of the critiques about the AIAS was that it was a discursive approach, which we believe is incorrect. And that's why we push back on the paper in there. And we've spoken to Thomas and Danny and Phil about that as well. But we believe that there is value in discussion with students. There's a difference between telling students you must do this and speaking to students to say these are our expectations. And the argument that assessment validity is completely negated when you say to students, you can't do this and I can't enforce it. Well, I don't think that argument fully holds true, because students do have some sort of a requirement themselves to uphold certain academic standards. And we can't control absolutely everything that a student does. If a student wants to cheat, they will find some ways to cheat. But if we are clear to students about expectations, this is something that is positive. But at the same time, only doing discursive options, and I guess the biggest and the worst example of that is when we've seen people adapt the AI assessment scale and they say, great, 5 levels, the first level being no AI. So here's a take-home essay, and it's set as level 1, no AI.
Yeah.
And that's complete. That really doesn't have any value at all, because just being able to saying that and not making a change to your assessment practices, that is not helpful for students. So structural changes are important, but so is discussion with students, and so is dialogue with students. It's a really critical part of maintaining that relationship between an educator and a student to try and support broader principles of academic integrity. In terms of challenges that institutions face and module leaders face, that is really, really hard. And I think there's been, as I was mentioning earlier, in terms of the approach taken by regulators in Australia, this has been something that they are requiring. So there's therefore an impetus for universities to really sit up and do something about that, which is a great way to push through those changes. Because, when you have a regulator breathing down your neck to say, okay, a year ago we asked you for your plans as to what you're going to do. Now you need to say what you've actually done and when you're going to implement this. This does tend to sort of push through those barriers that is often very difficult for a university to move into otherwise. So I think that's something that University of Sydney and other Australian universities have been able to do really well because of this regulatory approach. More broadly, though, we do see pushback, and when we introduced this into BUV, we had pushback from lecturers. And one of the pieces of research that we're just writing up now is looking at focus groups which we've run with academics from both BUV and another institution who implemented the AIAS, looking at the faculty challenges and what issues they've had. And so a lot of that work has also informed the commentary in terms of how not to use the AI assessment scale. Recognition that we need a bottom-up approach as well as a top-down approach, and having both is a really effective way of implementing the AIS. So as in you have subject level, discipline level expertise who can actually support their fellow faculty members or teachers in changing assessment, as well as just saying, here's a policy. Because just saying that there's a policy is quite hard for a lot of people to change. And things like having training, it is resource intensive, but it's one of those things that I think is really essential. So having AI literacy and what we talk about critical AI literacy for both staff and students, I think is really important there.
Do you think we could be a bit, certainly within the British universities, I think, could we be a bit more heavy-handed with this and say, you really, because a lot of the training is optional and there are workshops that put on, which are great and always really well run and interesting. But it creates a divide because there's people who will just think, oh, it's not my thing. So
yeah,
should we be a little bit more right? Everyone in a room, you are going to listen to this because this is important, and we need to make changes. And here is the information that we're going to share with you as a starting point. But something along those lines, because I maybe that's happening in Australia. It sounds like TEQSA is really pushing things forward there, but I'm not sure in the UK we're quite that. What's the word I'm looking for? Driven about the whole thing just yet.
Yeah, I think the UK system is already set up to have quite a lot of control, especially when it comes to assessment. Compared to like the North American system, where individual faculty members will just create an assessment, release it to students, mark the students, give students zeros, put their work into AI text detectors, do whatever they want without any effective processes. The people who I talk to in those systems are often aghast when I talk about the UK system in terms of what you mean. Someone else has got to approve your assessment before you can release it for moderation, and they seem that really against that. So I think when we're talking about actually making structural changes on the assessments, the UK is already has a good way of doing that if it's followed. Sometimes moderation can be taken seriously, other times it's maybe a bit of a rubber stamp. And I've seen various different ways that this is done well and not so well. So UK does well from that perspective, but maybe a regulatory push could help move things along. But it is really hard to, first of all, enforce mandatory training on faculty without a strong pushback from unions, change established ways of working. These are things that are difficult to do from the sector. I guess the way the sector is actually set up in the UK. So it's challenging, but if you want my opinion, yes, I think we could be more, UK could be more heavy-handed, but you might find people listening from other universities say, actually, we do enforce training. It's hard to give a very broad overview of that because I'm sure many universities and many faculties do that really well. It's just hard to do it as a whole sector.
Yeah. In the time we've got left, I just wanted to get some thoughts from you on the future direction. So I mean, there's a million ways in which we could progress here. There's so much I'd love to ask you, but what do you see that the sector sort of internationally and higher education generally is going to reach an equilibrium with AI? We're going to get to a point where we have a constructive relationship with students. Students are clear on the harms of things like cognitive offloading. They're understanding why they're learning what they're learning. They understand how to use AI in a responsible way, and our assessments are as secure as they can be. Do you see us sort of heading in that direction, or how far is it like climate change? Are we we're just heading for catastrophe?
Yeah. I think it's really difficult. I think that there may be in the next few years, we might see a bit more of a pushback from a regulatory approach saying you need to control this. And therefore, we might see universities being a bit hesitant to see what they can do and therefore push more towards examination-based approaches. That could be one direction where we see changes. Another way of thinking about this is on a bit of a global basis, from digitally advantaged compared to digitally disadvantaged institutions, countries, sectors, where digitally advantaged sectors and countries maybe move towards more different forms of assessment that are maybe more authentic and do recognize the benefits of generative AI, because there's more resources there to make broader changes to assessment practices, whereas we might then end up having digitally disadvantaged nations, universities, areas in the global south moving more towards that examination-focused approach. So we might start to see this growing digital divide because it's not possible to keep up with all these changes. So I think that's a big risk which we've got to be aware of. That it's great to say from the UK perspective, oh my God, we can't manage. But think about this from the global south perspective, where there's much fewer resources available, much less training available, much less digital literacy, potentially. It's hard to say that we can't do anything when we look at the broad range of technology that is available to different institutions. So I think it's hard to make predictions. I know there's currently a few competitions out to looking at what are going to be the predictions in higher ed, and sort of Jasper was making some predictions around this in terms of examinations. But I think there will be universities, at least in the UK, there will come a point in the next few years where they say we've got to do something, because we've only 3 years down the line. Once we see more than one cohort or more than one cycle of students going through, and we start to see changes in results, changes in hiring, graduate employability, that's when things start to become really serious for universities in terms of rankings as well. So maybe all the data is not quite there yet for them to make big decisions, hard decisions about how they're actually going to change practices.
Yeah, on the issue of employability, I was wondering about that, because the discourse is all around students will be using AI in the workplace, therefore they should use it here and at the university. And is this assumption that employers are going to value the ability to prompt over your subject knowledge? So if you could, I'm not sure we've got the balance quite right on that.
Yeah, although you could also make the same argument that how much does your individual subject knowledge matter for graduate employability in a large number of graduate jobs? Apart from very, very specific graduate jobs which are very subject dependent, a lot of the cases it's about look, what are you able to do more generally in terms of your skills and your critical thinking and your ability to analyze and your ability to communicate effectively in the workplace. These criticisms of graduate employability have gone on for a long time in terms of does the subject content really matter? I think that this idea that we all need to be AI wizards isn't necessarily the be all and end all, but it's not like AI is going to be taking your job, but somebody who can use AI to do better things, it might be the person who takes your job. So I think their universities do have a responsibility there to support students in that as part of their overall graduate attributes, but not at the expense of the subject discipline. We can't change thousands of years of education and subject knowledge because of a technology that, is disruptive, but we've had multiple disruptive technologies come in the past, and we will have in the future as well. So we still need to maintain that focus again on what are the learning outcomes, what are the learning outcomes for this program, and maybe we have additional ones related to AI, but we're not going to stop from teaching students and ensuring students know that core really core content that's required of them.
All right, Mike, end of a long working day for you, so I want to keep this last one pretty short. The one thing I did want to ask you, I kind of asked most people who come on here, we've got these quite successful writers and writing teams. You and Jasper and Leon and Jason have been, you've obviously formed this really, really successful team that works together. And a lot of audience members are interested in scholarship and, teachers who are producing their own published works. Do you have any advice? How did you guys get to work so well together? Sorry, I know it's a slightly cheesy question, but how did you form this kind of relationship to be as successful as it is? And have you got any advice for practitioners who might want to set up something similar and just, form a unit that's as probably won't achieve the productivity levels that you guys have, but, something along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that's evolved over a long period of time now. I've been writing with Jasper for I guess like 8 years or so now. We've been doing a lot of stuff together, and Jasper was working as an English teacher in the university, and we got chatting, and he expressed an interest in publishing. So I was like, well, why don't you get involved? I've got this project. Why don't you get involved on this project with me? And so Jasper wrote his first paper as part of that project, and then we just sort of carried on from there. So I guess some advice would be to maybe for slightly more senior colleagues, look towards junior colleagues or outside of the established academic or the traditional academic hierarchy to see who might be interested in supporting your work. So, the professional staff are often overlooked in these areas, but they're people, especially in scholarship, teaching and learning research, who have so much direct experience. So I think being broad and open in your approach to who you want to work with and who you want to write with would be something that would be really helpful. Aside from that, I guess it's making sure you've got a writing team who you actually like, who you're friends with, because you can only get so far if you are, you're not particularly close. Jasper and I have very, very good relationships there, being able to be open about what's working, what's not working in writing. And so that, being able to be open with your colleagues in that way is also something that might be helpful. So I guess look to this widening your network as to who you're maybe looking to write with and develop those relationships in that way.
Excellent. Thanks, Mike. Right. Links to resources. So if people want to catch up with you and follow you, I'll put is your LinkedIn profile the best?
Yeah, my LinkedIn is probably the best way for people to get in touch. Yeah, always happy to chat with people and always posting links to my papers on there. So that's a great way for people to see that. But also our AI assessment scale website, which we keep up to date with the latest papers and resources we've got available.
All right. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. Mike Perkins, thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil. It's been great to be here.